And you said in the book, she married me, and as a wedding gift, she gave me my career. She sacrificed financially in order to support you while you were in London. You were not earning your own way in London, despite the fact that you were dancing constantly.
Well, I couldn't, because they wouldn't let me. First of all, the Home Office wouldn't let me take jobs, and then I wasn't successful. That is, I was artistically successful to a degree, but I couldn't get a job. My first job was with Cochran, Charles Cochran, in the Gertie Lawrence show.
Tell me about Gertrude Lawrence. She was acting in this show,
She was
which
the
you
star,
were
Farron,
where you were directing the dancing.
Yes. Well, she was just magic, absolute magic, but very difficult to work with, because she never did the same thing twice.
What was the magic?
Well, you know magic when you see magic. You're bewitched.
I see.
She was absolutely iridescent on stage. I don't know anybody who had her quality. She couldn't sing at all well, and she acted in a rather strange, heightened way. It wasn't realistic acting, it was fantasy acting. But it was bewitching. And while she was on stage, she couldn't dance. It didn't matter. And funny, oh my. And also she could touch your heart very deeply. And she was chic and lovely and beautiful, and she was very stylish. She set the style for clothes of her time.
You met a great many famous people in those years in London. You've met a great many since, but I think of those particular years, and Noel Coward was associated with this same performance, was he not?
No, just a great friend. He was a great friend of Gertie's.
And it was Cole, as you said, it was Cole Porter's music, so obviously you worked with him. But the one
I met Bernard Shaw.
That's the one I wanted to ask you about, because you described him as the sexiest man you ever met.
Oh, he was tremendous.
One doesn't think of George Bernard Shaw as a sex symbol.
Well, because you've read his letters and you've read too much about him. But when he bounded into the room, and there was absolutely, he was 70-odd, there's no other word. And his beard all crisp and white, and he was Pan.
Pan. Pan, I see.
P-A-N.
And you had lunch with him?
Yes, in his flat in London. And the conversation was just incredible. He never spoke until the conversation was ripe for the absolutely killing conclusion or sentence. His wife worked it up, and the guests helped. And then when he felt he was ready to say the thing, he gave the coup de grace, and it was memorable and carved in stone and dead also. Then you started another subject.
Almost as though it were staged.
Almost. She was the most marvelous second man I have ever heard work. And she'd always speak of him as GBS, what GBS said.
Did you meet John Dewey, as I recall?
Oh, he was a great friend of my mother's, because he was a devoted follower of my grandfather, Henry George. You know, he said, not since Plato have there been 7 greater philosophic thinkers.
And the followers of your grandfather, the single taxers, you've described as your chaperones.
Well, Mother knew that they'd keep a terribly watchful eye on me, and I had to escape their surveillance if I wanted any kind of young life, and I managed to, but it took a good deal of plotting.
Despite your association with them and your support of them, you found some of them rather dull people, I gather.
Well,
single taxers does sound as though they might be rather preoccupied with economics.
They're fanatics, absolutely besotted. But there were some great ones, like Lord Wedgwood, and some extraordinary ones, and Bernard Shaw was one for a time, you know. But the ones that I knew, dull in the sense, they were very fine thinkers, but they were one-track people. And really absolutely hooded on this, and that's always a little bit wearing. The Danish single taxes were much more fun, very much more fun.
What about your grandfather, Henry George? How well did you know him?
Oh, he died long before I was born.
That's what I was afraid of.
Yes, you know, he ran for the mayoralty of New York and dropped dead on the eve of election. It was very dramatic and tragic. Tammany later conceded that in a previous election he had been elected, but they stuffed all the ballot boxes and changed it, and he was materially influential in getting what we call the Australian ballot, or the ballot we now use.
I see.
Which came from Australia.
But I gather his determination was passed on to your mother and then passed on to you.
To a certain degree. It's still going. You know, there's a school, and we have all sorts of things. There's an underground movement. I think we better have some sense economically, don't you?
Yes, indeed. You left London at the invitation of your uncle, who up to that point had not provided any particular help to you in your career. None.
None.
And he invited you to come to Hollywood.
Yes.
And this was, I guess, the first real big job, in a sense, that you had. What happened?
Well, in Hollywood it was.
In Hollywood.
Well, doing a big Cochrane show is a good big job. I mean, for Europe and London it was big. And I'd made a success.
I just wondered, in terms of payment, he
didn't pay me anything much. He paid me $250 a week. It was a whole lot more than I'd been getting.
That's what I meant. It was a bigger paying job, and still not very.
In terms of Hollywood, that is paltry.
Yes.
And my fare one way.
One way?
One way. And I didn't have the wit to say I must have it returned. But anyway, it was to dance naked on the bare back of a bull. Well, I feel very uneasy with cows. And however...
That sounds like almost the stereotype of Hollywood, an almost unbelievable kind of thing.
But Cecil was like that. Cecil was stereotype, but he invented stereotype. And he believed it so completely and with such flamboyance that his pictures still stand as absolute top examples of their kind. And there are always marvelous things in them. What I think he failed to do, mind you, I haven't been asked, but given me the opportunity to say, is photograph men and women. I don't think he'd ever met any.
Any men and women, real people?
No, I don't think so. He saw them in terms of historic symbols. And when he did, let's say, the Exodus, I think it's moving to the point of tears. But home scenes of Moses and his mother, I think, are not so convincing.
You describe him so succinctly in your book. He kept sex, sadism, patriotism, real estate, religious and public relations dancing in midair like jugglers' balls for 50 years.
Well,
That's
he did.
Quite a combination.
Well, he did. And he died rich, and he died successful, and he died very famous, and he's one of the few Hollywood figures that stayed at the top right through. And when he died, he had 6 pages of the Los Angeles Times dedicated to him. It's, you know, that's very unusual.
Well, the end of this particular story, if you're going to dance naked on the back of a bull, was not a particularly happy association.
No, he said I had no sex. The bull didn't seem to, well, I don't know. Anyway, there was a matter of, it wasn't a matter I could discuss naked under the searchlights in front of the entire company. If he thought I had no sex, I had no sex as far as he was concerned, but it hurt my feelings.
I should think it would. And so you returned to Europe then?
I returned to Europe.
When did you move from dancing into completely into choreography?
Well,
you had decided then that you weren't going to be a dancer. At some point you had decided, did you?
No, I was told.
I see.
And that was after I came back from Europe and was employed by Ballet Theatre, which is now known as the American Ballet Theatre, and I think it's the finest company in America, to do some choreography. And I said, fine, I will. And I'll do this for myself. And the gentleman who was hiring me said, you will not dance in it. You have to do something you won't dance in. And I said, I won't do it. And he said, listen to me. I've seen Joaquin make this mistake. I've seen Modkin make this mistake. You will stretch your talents and you will become a much bigger artist if you will work for somebody else. You're always working for your own body and your own personality, and it's limiting you. And he never spoke a truer word, nor did I ever listen to one. I didn't want to. That's again what I say. I didn't want to. I fought that. But I had to get outside of myself and see what a really well-trained body could do and what somebody who didn't have my particular knacks. I'm a good comedian, for instance. I had to work with somebody who wasn't such a good comedian and put it into the gesture. And it did stretch me out.
Yes. How do you bring this about in working with others and get them to
Oh, that's
perform?
a long process. I think
slow process?
Long and slow and tedious. And I have to think it through my own body first, you know, and do things. And then I get a chosen few who know me pretty well, and I know them. And we lock ourselves away secretly, and I just try things out hour by hour until I get a piece of movement that looks quite wonderful and effective and rhythmic and, you know, with a beat in it.
Does it have to feel good as well?
Yes, always does.
Yes.
And then I said, that's that. And then when I get enough of them, then I have building blocks, so to speak. And I have my vocabulary for the new dance. And then I put it on the dancers who are going to do it. and then I redo it, and redo it, and redo it. Jerry Robbins.
Does that mean it's never finished?
Oh yes, it's sometimes finished. I'm never quite satisfied, but sometimes I just leave things alone that I'm not satisfied with because I just have got to stop fussing and tampering. Jerry Robbins said to me, you know, I work the first 3 days on something, and I go in prepared, and it doesn't matter if I prepare 6 months. The first 3 days are just garbage and have to be thrown out. And he said, why can't you do the first 3 days before you go into rehearsal?
But it's just a stage you have to go through.
Well, you see, the big good things come instinctively. They come almost by accident. But you can't count on this, and you never get them if you haven't done the slugging work before.
Yeah. Was Rodeo the first big success in this respect?
Yes, it was. And it was a real, true success.
And it was done with the Ballet Russe.
Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo during the war, and we got 22 curtain calls at the Metropolitan Opera House the opening night.
And with European dancers, was there any difficulty?
No, they weren't.
They weren't.
So many. There were a great many American and Canadians, though they had Russian names. And the reason I was permitted to do it was because we were in war, and they suddenly decided it would be a very good, patriotic, and timely thing. Popular, you see. If they did an American ballet on an American subject by an American, this was the bizarre aspect, because generally it had been done by a Russian. And so they came to me and said, did I have an idea? And I didn't, but I said, of course I do. And then I thought hard for 2 days and came up with this and got Aaron Copland, demanded Aaron Copland, and we got to work. And it's about writing and so forth. A lot of the work I'd prepared in London before, and I showed it to the people. And the Russians said, this is not dancing. And I said, I didn't say it was, but this is what you're going to have to do. And they just left the room all block. So that left the Americans and Canadians.
And you could teach them about...
They were willing to be taught. And those men never moved like that. I tell you, when they hit the stage that night, there was a roar from the house. There really was.
There was.
I'm not exaggerating.
And the cast itself, I suspect, was very excited about this kind of
tremendous.
dance.
And the men in the pit playing the score for the first time. You know, it's a very fine score. It's become American tradition.
Yes, of course.
Well, they're standing up, you know, beating with their bows on the strings. You don't get the Union boys to do that. It was an extraordinary night.
What about the night that Oklahoma opened?
Well, you know, it wasn't so much of a success.
It wasn't?
No, we couldn't fill the house. Not nearly. I knew it was going to be something of a success because of the Boston success. And so I'd bought 10 tickets, I think it was, or maybe it was 8, in the front row of the balcony. You could afford them then. It was $2.50 each, or maybe these tickets were $2. And I was getting $50 a week at that point. But I did, because it was a splurge, it was a gala. And then I couldn't find people to put in them. I went out onto 44th Street and dragged in some dancers that were loitering and said, you want to see an opening? And they weren't averse, so they came in and sat down. And the press wasn't all that much the first night.
Why?
I don't know why. Brigadoon's press was better. But this rolled up. My goodness me, what happened?
Yes.
2 days later, 3 days later, the queue was around the block. And I went off to get engaged to a soldier, and came back and was being interviewed by somebody from the New York Times, and he said something, and this man said, I don't think, Mr. Mill, you realize what kind of a success this is that you've participated in. And I said, well, never having had a real one, I said, what kind? He said, probably the biggest in the 20th century. And I said, well, for goodness sakes. You know, my salary didn't change. Nothing changed for me.
You've not made a great deal of money out of this.
Not out of Oklahoma, I haven't. Very, very little. But the contract stuck. I mean, I first signed to do for $1,500, no royalties, all rights given up, all. And then Dick Rogers heard about this, and he thought that was not quite fair, so he arranged for me to get $50 a week. And then after the Times man said this, I went to the Theatre Guild and said to Lawrence Langdon, I'm going to marry a soldier on pay, you know, private, no grade, and he has no money, and I have no money, and I have 10 years of debts. Do you think you could make it $75 a week? And he said, no, I couldn't. And so they didn't. So that was that. But then I did have, of course, chances to work other places.
What has been important to you, Mr. Mill? You came from a famous family, so it can't be entirely fame, which you now enjoy. Money, which you've not always been able to
well,
get.
I did get some, you know, but the government took most of it.
What has been important? Just the chance to do what you wanted to do?
That. And do you know that's the most precious thing in the world? I don't think I've ever in my life had to work at something I despised. And now you ask how many people that's true.
I suspect very few.
I mean, I see so many businessmen and people in the business end of the theaters. I love what I'm doing. And when I went down south to do this heritage company with these children in a gymnasium and young kids, I worked for nothing. So did they, poor things, but they were students. To see the ideas flower on their faces and in their bodies, and I'd say, stop, do it this way and on this count, and there'd be a yell from the kids because they got the idea. Well, now look, this is just heaven. This is very great.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mill.
Here at Hunter, I was able to get a foreign policy internship at the Clinton Foundation and work down the hall from former President Clinton on pressing foreign policy issues and writing foreign policy briefs. And those are experiences that are open to all Hunter students, to all CUNY students, and that's part of what makes CUNY so special. Coming out of CUNY, and particularly being a woman of color and trying to move into these spheres that, for me coming from Tucson, Arizona, were very foreign in many different ways, really took a confidence and a belief that came from my mentors at Hunter, who really helped shape and push me to apply for these opportunities. And I think that if I had a message for other CUNY students, it would be to apply for everything. That you are good enough, that you are worth it, that you can do the work, and that you can get it.
Why did I bother coming to BMCC, you ask, to get a college degree in my 60s? The reason is, well, because it is never too late. For me, my dream took 50 years to become reality. I hope your dreams take less time. But however long they take, it is never too late to chase them.
"24 hours, 1,440 minutes, 86,400 seconds. Today is the day to give a little, get a lot." Show the love for all your favorite programs on CUNY TV and take part in CUNY Tuesday, a 24-hour challenge to raise money to support your favorite shows. We appreciate your support and will always strive to do our very best for you, our loyal viewers. The clock's ticking. Visit tv.cuny.edu/give for more information. You're watching CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg Lerner.
Oil, the black gold which fuels the American economic machine. One man, one company had a monopoly of the American oil industry. Could anything break it? At a time when the government was breaking up a monopoly in oil, why did it sanction a monopoly in the telephone industry? Would antitrust laws still apply in a new economy whose major product is intellectual property? Monopoly. Who's in control? With the help of our economic analysts Richard Gill and Nariman Baravesh, we'll find out on this 21st century edition of Economics USA. I'm David Shoemaker. We like to think of our economy as one that runs on competition. For instance, we can choose the brand of gasoline we buy. If one station sets its prices too high, then we can simply go across the street for a lower price. If enough drivers pass the high price station by, sooner or later it goes out of business. Of course, if in order to attract business, a station sets its prices too low and can't cover costs, sooner or later it'll go out of business too. But what happens to prices if one company or one person controls all the gas stations? That was what the country faced in 1890. The company was Standard Oil. The man was John D. Rockefeller. This was the infant oil industry John D. Rockefeller saw after the Civil War. Drilling equipment was hand and foot operated in those days and available cheap. Anybody could join the oil rush, and anybody did. With thousands of small-scale prospectors, drillers, and refiners competing, the supply of oil was plentiful. Prices were low, and so were profits. Rockefeller had been doing well as a Cleveland produce wholesaler, but he thought he could do better in oil. Ruth Sheldon Knowles came from an Oklahoma oil family, and her book, The Greatest Gamblers, told the industry's history.
Rockefeller stayed out of the drilling end because he didn't want to lose any money. He was the one who always wanted to make the money. And when he saw that there was such a thing as drilling dry holes and you could lose money, it was obvious to him in the beginning that there was going to be as much money lost in looking for oil as there would be made by finding it.
Rockefeller bought the oil that other men drilled, refined it, and sold it. By 1869, he had the largest refinery in the country. And a year later, Standard Oil of Ohio was born. When competition squeezed profit margins, Rockefeller squeezed the competition. Willing competitors were bought. Unwilling competitors found themselves cut off from railroads, pipelines, and credit.
By having the monopoly that he had originally, which in refining and in pipelining, he was able to control the price of oil for the producers, and the independents hated Rockefeller. For example, there was an incident of a farmer who stubbed his toe on a rock, and he said, "Damn the Standard Oil Company." Everybody blamed the Standard Oil Company for anything that happened.
Under Rockefeller's guidance, the industry quickly became less crowded. As competition dropped, then disappeared, Rockefeller set prices where Standard could make the highest profits. Standard Oil and other monopolies, like U.S. Steel, General Electric, AT&T, and International Harvester, became price makers, but their methods left some bruises. Georgetown University law professor Thomas L. Krattenmaker.
The Standard Oil Trust was formed in 1882, and that led to widespread public concern. And it was that public reaction to the trusts that led to the passage of the Sherman Act in 1890. The Sherman Act made it illegal for any one firm to obtain a monopoly, that is, to get a complete control over the production of all the goods in one market. And secondly, the Sherman Act made it illegal for firms to get together and agree on the way in which they would compete, for example, by setting prices or dividing markets or determining which customers they would deal with. The Sherman Act was one of only several choices that could have been made in 1890. Congress could have chosen to nationalize the trusts. It could have chosen to set up a large government department to oversee the behavior of the trusts, or even to run the trusts in cooperation with private enterprise. And those are devices that are widely adopted in other countries around the world. Instead, what they did is they hearkened back to the American belief in leaving power in private hands, but dispersing that power.
Changing economic and historical trends is like turning around a huge ocean liner. It's not something you do quickly. Congress may have set the course when it passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, but it was 20 years and 4 presidents later before the Supreme Court finally broke up Standard Oil. Even then, the court didn't outlaw all monopolies, just those that were unreasonably anti-competitive, the so-called rule of reason. But by the turn of the century, mighty Standard was under attack on another flank. The enemy, a ragged band of Texas and Oklahoma wildcatters and roughnecks. Their ammunition, vast new southwestern oil discoveries. The first battleground, Spindletop. The year was 1901. Dallas oil man Robert Goddard.
My father, Charles Goddard, moved down here from Ohio in 1901 when Spindletop opened up. Well, he was a driller at first. You'd call him tool pusher, I guess. He was the one that ran the rig and that knew how to drill for oil, and there were very few people in those days that drilled. The oilman had to move where the oil was, and usually there was no city there. Tent cities sprung up, and little communities with dirt streets and maybe some board sidewalks, but it was a rough place to live in.
What difference did Spindletop really make?
The biggest difference was the amount of production that they found they could obtain out of one well. If you can make 100 barrels a day or 1,000 barrels a day, now you're in an economic, a viable business. You really have a product to sell. Once you had real production, I would say that was the end of any monopoly.
By 1911, Rockefeller's command of the market was shattered. Competition from Western Oil, from refiners like Gulf and Texaco, had broken the Standard monopoly, and the Sherman Act had ended the era of the big trusts. The market and the people had delivered the same message. Free enterprise depended on competition for resources like oil and for consumers' dollars. Monopoly power over production and prices couldn't be tolerated. Economic analyst Richard Gill explains why monopolies like Standard almost always result in low production, high prices, and high profits.
The complaints against Standard are based on the central economic critique of monopolies. They keep output too low, and their prices and profits are too high. When Rockefeller went into the oil industry in the 1860s, it was competitive. Thousands of competing firms, each of which was too small to affect the price of its product, oil. They were price takers, as economists call them, meaning that their price was set in the market by supply and demand. If the economy-wide demand curve for oil looked like this, and the supply curve looked like this, then price would end up at this level, $9.50 a barrel, and output would be here, say 2 million barrels. Because of competition, each firm would be able to make only ordinary profits, that is to say, just to cover its costs. Now, the thing about monopolists, like Rockefeller in the late 19th century, is that they happily take control of the whole market. Faced with the power of such a giant firm like Standard Oil, competitors find entry into the industry virtually impossible. This means that this single monopolist faces the same economy-wide demand curve as all those thousands of competitive firms had. The only difference is that he doesn't have to take the market price as given. He is a price setter and not a price taker. And he will certainly find it in his interest to set this price well above the competitive supply and demand level. He does this, say, by restricting output to here and selling at this price of $14 a barrel, well above the competitive level and well above his costs. This means he will be making not just ordinary or normal profits, but excess profits. But why does he stop at $14? Why doesn't he raise the price up to $15, $16, perhaps way up here? One fairly obvious reason is that after a time, the loss in sales may hurt him even more than the higher price gains him. He is ultimately trying to maximize profits, not to take the consumer for all he's worth. Still, there is no doubt that the consumer will be gouged pretty well, that output will be restricted, and that profits will be abnormally high. On all three counts, the robber barons of the old days stand convicted, though, as we shall see, there is a bit more to the monopoly story than just this.
Hello Central, can't you see? Kindly hurry just for me. Please, dear, get to me, San Francisco. Someone's waiting all alone. Hello, Frisco, hello.
Perhaps more than any other company, the phone company made the connections that pulled us together. But Ma Bell was a monopoly. On the other hand, is there such a thing as a good monopoly? And if there is, how do you control it? And if the government allows a monopoly, is it committed to it forever? Well, for more than 60 years, the government gave the telephone company one set of answers. Alexander Graham Bell's original patents expired around the turn of the century. Almost every city had 2 or 3 telephone systems, so callers needed 2 or 3 phones to be sure of being able to call around town. Competition meant lower prices and lower profits, and Bell fought back. It slashed rates to undercut some competitors and bought others out. Others were cut off from equipment or from the long-distance network, which Bell controlled and which only Bell could afford. Wounded independents began asking the government to take Bell to court under antitrust laws the way it had Standard Oil. Then, in 1914, AT&T President Theodore Vail sent AT&T Vice President Nathan C. Kingsbury to Washington. He set up a deal that would create what Vail called a natural monopoly. We asked Pickard Wagner of AT&T what was in the Kingsbury commitment.
The key part of it, of course, was the commitment to refrain from buying up any more independent telephone companies, that it would provide long-distance connections to the independent, which means the non-Bell companies, which then existed.
Mr. Wagner, what do you think prompted Theodore Vail to give up the fight, so to speak, and decide to go into an agreement with the federal government?
AT&T got the government off its back. And with the Kingsbury commitment, we were able to go ahead and set up the long-distance network. And we were assured that the government was not going to come in and take away from us that long-distance network.
Henry Geller, former general counsel of the Federal Communications Commission, was one of the government's key telephone policy makers. Well, I can understand what was in it for the phone companies, but why did the government buy this arrangement?
Government bought it because what he promised them was universal service. He was going to, at reasonable rates, he was going to, as a monopoly, he could expand, give this integrated end-to-end service. It was good service. Remember, it's not a cliche. The U.S. had the best telephone service and still has the best telephone service in the world.
When you consider, back then with the muckrakers and all of the trust busting that was going on, this almost seemed to run counter to the currents of those times.
But even then, I want to go back to something. Vail may actually have been right. You remember that the only technology then is the wire. How many of them are you going to string? It's very expensive to string it. You're not going to string 2 down the street. There are economies of scale, and you will end up with one company buying out the other.
How did the other side of the Kingsbury commitment work? How effectively did the government regulate the phone company?
If you get onto that, the Bell system got so big that regulation of the Bell system became very difficult to do, extremely difficult. In a nutshell, I think that regulation failed at all times.
This was the AT&T we grew up with, the benevolent Ma Bell holding families together.
And why are you crying? Because Joy said I'd call. Just because I love you, Ma.
But by the 1970s and 80s, not everybody thought that Mother knew best.
What on earth are you crying for?
Have you seen our long-distance bill?
If your long-distance bills are too much, call MCI. Sure, reach out and touch someone. Just do it for a whole lot less.
The Bell monopoly began with technology. Technology maintained it, and then technology from the Bell Labs finally ended it. During World War II, the Bell Labs had developed microwave technology, the ability to send sound 20 to 30 miles through the air. But then in the 1960s, a couple of men named Jack Golkin and Bill McGowan came up with an idea on how to use those microwaves.
I came up with this idea to put this microwave from Chicago to St. Louis, not to compete with AT&T, but to expand our two-way radio business, find more customers. So we filed an application with the FCC, and within a few weeks, AT&T, Illinois Bell, Southwestern Bell, General Telephone Electronics, and Western Union all filed petitions to deny our applications. So to get the money to build this thing, in '68 we brought Bill McGowan in to do the financing.
When I investigated it, I thought that the concept, if it was changed, could make sense. Not individual ones, but a nationwide system hooked together. The ability to be able to provide then existing technology, microwave, as a competitive service to what had been up to then a monopoly, AT&T, the Bell system, in long-distance communication services.
What you had was a revolution in how telecommunications went about its business of switching and of communicating between points. And the revolution, the computer, the microwave, the satellite, were really available to everybody.